The night my daughter-in-law Cheryl handed me a cardboard box and told me I had until morning to clear out. It was 31 degrees outside and the windshield of my old truck was already frosted over. I stood in the doorway of the house I had helped build, literally, with my own hands, weekends for 2 years, while Gloria was still strong enough to hand me nails from the bucket. And I looked at that box. A coffee mug. A framed photo of Gloria and me at Crater Lake. 3 flannel shirts. A paperback I'd been halfway through for a month. "We'll have the locks changed by Friday," Cheryl said. She didn't look up from her phone. My son Warren was standing behind her. He didn't say a word. I didn't say a word either. I just picked up the box and walked out to the truck. That was January. Gloria had been gone 11 days. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further. When I tell this story, people always want me to say that I saw it coming, that I had some gut feeling, some warning sign I chose to ignore because I was in love and maybe a little blind. And I suppose that's the version that makes the most sense, the wise old man who missed the obvious. But the truth is, I didn't see it coming. Not really. Not the way it actually happened. Gloria and I met when I was 54 years old. I'd been a widower for 6 years at that point. My first wife, Anne, passed from ovarian cancer back when Warren was 19, and those years afterward were the kind of quiet that hollows a man out. I worked. I kept the house in Medford. I watched Warren grow up and move to Portland and marry Cheryl and have 2 kids. I mowed my lawn. I went to church sometimes. I ate a lot of frozen dinners and told myself I was doing fine. Then I met Gloria at a church potluck, and she laughed at something I said, I don't even remember what, and the sound of it caught me completely off guard. Like hearing a song you forgot you loved. Gloria was 62 when we met. She had 3 adult children from her first marriage, Warren's age and older. Lowell was the oldest at 43, sharp as a tack, worked in commercial real estate in Denver. Then there was Renata, 41, who lived in Bend with her husband and kept mostly to herself. And then the youngest, Slade, 38, who I can only describe as a man who had never quite been told no enough times in his life. I knew going in that it was complicated. Gloria's first husband, a contractor named Roy, had died 8 years before we met, and he'd left behind a substantial estate. Gloria was careful about money in a way that I respected. She kept her finances separate from mine. We talked about it early on, openly, and she was direct. She had obligations to her children, she had her own accounts, and she wanted to keep things structured that way. I understood. I had Warren and my own savings from 30 years of working in HVAC installation and eventually running my own small crew. We weren't merging empires. We were just 2 people who didn't want to be alone anymore. We got married in June 3 years after we met. Small ceremony. Her backyard in Ashland. For 6 years, things were good. Not perfect. Lowell was always polite but distant, and Slade had a way of make-amkens that sat wrong with you after he'd already left the room, but good. Gloria and I traveled when we could. We did the Oregon coast every fall. We drove to see Warren's kids in Portland at Christmas. We planted a vegetable garden that never did produce much beyond zucchini, but we were proud of it anyway. And then Gloria got sick. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Fast-moving. The doctors used words like aggressive and treatment-resistant and eventually palliative, and somewhere in there the whole shape of our life changed. I was her caregiver for 14 months. I drove her to every appointment. I learned more about medication schedules and insurance claims and hospital discharge paperwork than I ever wanted to know. I held her hand through the hard nights and pretended to sleep so she wouldn't worry about me worrying about her. In those 14 months, Lowell visited twice. Renata came once and stayed 4 days. Slade called occasionally but was always between things, always about to be in town, always something that came up. I'm not saying this to cast judgment. Grief makes people strange and avoidant, and I know that. What I'm saying is that by the time Gloria passed, it was mostly just the 2 of us who had been in that house day after day, and I had stopped thinking about what came next, because what came next was unimaginable. She passed on a Thursday morning in January, at home, in our bedroom, with the winter light coming through the curtains, in a way that I still can't think about directly. The attorney's name was Fitzgerald, Phil Fitzgerald, out of Medford, who Gloria had been working with for years before I came along. He called me 4 days after Gloria passed and asked if I could come in at the end of the following week, once her children had been notified and could arrange to be present. I said, of course. I spent that week doing what you do. I called people. I made arrangements. Lowell and Renata and Slade all arrived the day before the reading, and for a night and a morning there was something that almost felt like a shared grief. We ate takeout from a Thai place on Siskiyou Boulevard. Slade made a joke that was a little too soon and a little too loud, and Renata gave him a look, and it was actually sort of normal. Human. Phil Fitzgerald's office was on the second floor of a building downtown, with the kind of waiting room that tries to feel warm but mostly just feels neutral. We sat in a row, me on one end, Lowell, Renata, Slade. Phil was in his 60s, soft-spoken, and he read the will with the careful neutrality of someone who had done this many times and knew that neutrality was a kindness. The estate was larger than I had realized. I knew Gloria had money. I didn't know how much. Roy had done well in construction, very well, and Gloria had managed his estate carefully for 8 years before we married. Phil read the total, and I watched Lowell's expression do something complicated. The figure was just over $4 million in liquid assets, plus the house in Ashland, which had been appraised at $840,000, nearly $5 million in total. To Lowell, 40% of the liquid assets. To Renata, 30%. To Slade, 20%. To me, 10% of the liquid assets, roughly $400,000, and a single item described in the will as the contents and deed to the storage property on Culver Road, Lot 7. I didn't know what that was. Slade caught on faster than I did. I could see it in the way he leaned forward slightly, then deliberately sat back. Lowell was already doing math in his head. Renata looked at me with something I couldn't read. Phil explained that the house in Ashland was to be sold, and the proceeds split evenly 3 ways among the children. I was welcome to remain in the property through the end of February to allow time for transition. End of February. It was January 14th. I drove home alone. Cheryl, my daughter-in-law, Warren's wife, had driven up from Portland for the reading, though she hadn't come inside. I found out later she'd been waiting in the parking lot. By the time I got back to the house, she and Warren had apparently talked by phone, because when I came in, Cheryl was already in the kitchen with a notepad. She wasn't unkind, exactly. She just wasn't soft about it. She explained, as though I might not have understood Phil Fitzgerald's plain English, that the house would need to go on the market soon, that Lowell was coordinating the listing, and that it would be easier for everyone. And she did say, everyone. If I could plan to be out sooner rather than later. You're not being asked to leave immediately, she said. But Friday would be practical. It was Tuesday. Warren didn't look at me. I went to the bedroom that had been mine and Gloria's for 6 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the curtains. The same curtains. I thought about calling someone. I couldn't think of who. I packed a bag that night, not the cardboard box that came the next morning, when Cheryl had organized what she'd determined was mine versus what belonged to the house. I didn't fight about the coffee maker. I did keep the photo from Crater Lake. I drove to a Motel 6 on the edge of town and paid for a week with my debit card and sat in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and tried to understand what had just happened to me. The storage property on Culver Road, Lot 7. I'd been up Culver Road before, years ago, but I didn't know of any storage facility out there. It was mostly rural, some small farms, a few hobby properties, a gravel operation. Phil Fitzgerald had handed me a physical key at the end of the meeting, old brass, the kind that fits a padlock, and a copy of the deed with an address I had to look up on my phone because I didn't recognize it. I put off going for 3 days. I don't entirely know why. I think part of me was afraid that it would be nothing, a storage unit full of old furniture or boxes of Roy's papers. And I wasn't ready to have that be the end of the story. But on a Thursday morning, about a week after the reading, I drove out Culver Road. The property was about 4 miles outside of town, set back from the road behind a split-rail fence that needed repair. There was a gate. The padlock was old, but the key fit, and a gravel drive that wound through maybe 200 yards of overgrown scrub oak before opening up into a clearing. What I found there was not a storage unit. It was 11 acres of land, flat and clear at the center, with a creek running along the north edge. There was a small wooden building, not much more than a large shed really, that had been locked up and clearly unused for some time. But the land itself was something. Good soil, good drainage, and the location. I pulled up a map on my phone and just sat there in my truck with the engine off. The property sat at the intersection of two county roads, less than a mile from the interchange of a state highway, that, according to everything I could find, was slated for a significant commercial development expansion. I'd actually read something about it in the local paper a year ago, and forgotten. A distribution hub, a planned retail corridor. I sat in that truck for a long time. I'm 67 years old. I've been installing and servicing HVAC systems since I was 22. I know land values the way a doctor knows blood pressure numbers, roughly, in context. What I was looking at, in the right timeline, wasn't a storage lot. It was worth more than everything else in that will combined. I want to tell you something about Gloria that I haven't been able to say out loud until recently. She knew, not the exact number, not the future, but she knew that land was valuable. Roy had acquired it in the late 90s as a long-term hold, and she'd kept it quietly all these years because she understood what patient waiting could produce. She'd told Phil Fitzgerald, apparently, that I was the only person she trusted to do something sensible with it, rather than sell it in a hurry. I found a letter. It was tucked inside the wooden building, in a coffee can on a shelf, sealed in a plastic bag with my name on the outside in Gloria's handwriting. I won't share everything she wrote. Some of it is mine alone. But she said this: Warren, I know you've been watching out for your dad even when he didn't know it. This land is my way of watching out for him when I can't be there anymore. Don't let anyone rush you. The timing matters. And please, plant something. Roy always meant to and never got around to it. She'd written Warren by mistake. She crossed it out and wrote sweetheart above it. I choose to believe it was a slip of the pen, the way your mind reaches for familiar names when the feeling is big enough. I sat on the floor of that little wooden building and read that letter twice, and then I put it back in the coffee can. I should tell you about Slade. About 2 weeks after the will reading, while I was still staying at the motel, Slade called me. He was friendly in a way that put my teeth on edge, the particular friendliness of someone who wants something and has decided that warmth is the fastest route. He said he'd been thinking about me. Said he was sorry he hadn't been around more during the hard months. Said his mother loved me, and he knew that. All true things, probably in some form. And then he said he'd heard I'd inherited some property out on Culver Road, and that he and Lowell had been talking, and they thought, out of respect for their mother's memory, out of a desire to keep things clean and settled, they'd be happy to take that property off my hands. They'd have it appraised and pay me fairly. It would simplify everything. I said I appreciated the thought, and I'd need some time. He said, of course, no pressure at all, just whenever I was ready. I hung up and sat with that for a minute. Then Lowell called. Different approach, more formal, more business speak, references to fair market assessment, and avoiding complications. He mentioned that rural land without development infrastructure could be a liability, carrying costs, tax implications. He wasn't wrong that there were carrying costs. He was wrong about everything else. I didn't call either of them back. Instead, I called a man named Ted Burrows. No, wait. I should say his name was actually Douglas Wren, an old acquaintance from my HVAC days who'd gone into commercial real estate appraisal. I hadn't talked to him in 4 or 5 years. I explained what I had and where it was, and asked him if he knew anything about the development corridor on the highway. There was a pause on the line. Phil, he said. That's what he always called me, short for my middle name, Philip. Where exactly did you say this parcel is? I gave him the address. Another pause. How fast can you get me a copy of the deed? I won't walk you through all the details of the next 3 months, because some of it is still in process, and some of it involves agreements I've been asked not to publicize. What I can tell you is this: Douglas drove out to the property twice. He brought a colleague the second time. He made calls. He sent emails. He came back to me 6 weeks later with a formal assessment that I read 3 times in the parking lot of a Subway restaurant because I needed somewhere to sit, and it was raining, and I couldn't go back to a motel room for this. The assessed development value, not current market, not raw land value, but the figure accounting for the expansion project and the projected timeline, was somewhere between $8 and $12 million. depending on how the parceling went. I'm 67 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Klamath Falls. My father worked at a lumber mill. I've had a good life and a hard life and an honest life, and I have never, not once, been in the same room with a number like that. I sat in that subway parking lot for 45 minutes. Lowell called again in March. Slade had apparently told him I wasn't responding, so Lowell decided to escalate to what I can only describe as a velvet ultimatum. He said his mother's estate was fully settled now, that there was no outstanding business between us, and that he wanted to make sure I understood the exposure involved in holding an undeveloped rural parcel. He offered me $180,000 for a property now assessed between $8 and $12 million. I want to be charitable here. I think Lowell had done some research. I think he knew the corridor was developing. I think he calculated that I was a 67-year-old retiree living in a motel who didn't have the resources or connections to navigate a commercial land deal, and that the gap between what he offered and what the property was worth was a gap he expected to exploit. I said I'd think about it. He said the offer had a window. I said I understood. Then I called Douglas Wren and told him to move forward with the introductions he'd been setting up with 3 commercial development groups who had already expressed preliminary interest. Renata called me in April. Of the 3, Renata had always been the one I understood least. Quiet, self-contained, a little hard to read. She'd been at the will reading, she'd been polite, but she'd mostly stayed out of the conversations about the Culver Road property. She called to apologize. Not for anything specific, exactly. She said she knew her brothers had been pressuring me, and she was sorry for that. She said her mother had loved me and that she, Renata, thought I was a good man, and that she hoped I knew that. I told her I appreciated it. She asked if I was okay. Not a transaction, just a question. I told her I was getting there. We talked for about 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Her kids, her garden in Bend, the weather. When we hung up, I sat for a while thinking about how grief separates people, and sometimes, given enough time and distance, you can find your way back to something honest. I don't know if Lowell or Slade will ever call me with anything other than an angle. But I think about Renata sometimes, and I think Gloria would have been glad about that phone call. I moved out of the Motel 6 in late February when a man from my church, a widower himself, a few years older than me, named Clifton, offered me a room in his house until I found my footing. That kind of generosity doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. I found a rental in April. Small house, East Medford, good light in the kitchen. I planted tomatoes in the back, because Gloria's letter told me to plant something, and I couldn't do much about 11 acres just yet. But I could do tomatoes. Warren called me in May. We hadn't spoken since the morning I left the Ashland house. He called from his cell, not the home number, which told me something. He said he'd been thinking. He said he knew things had moved fast after his mom passed, and that maybe some of it hadn't been handled right. I let him finish. I said I wasn't angry at him. I meant it. He's my son, and he loved his mother in his way, and grief had made him go along with things he probably shouldn't have. I told him I wanted him in my life. I told him I wanted to see his kids. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, what happened with that land out on Culver Road?" I smiled at the window. "It worked out," I said. I didn't give him the number. That felt right. Some things you hold for a while before you let them loose into the world. The negotiation with the development group took the better part of 4 months. Douglas Wren earned every cent of his fee. There were moments when I thought it might fall through. A zoning review that got complicated, a competing offer from a group out of Portland that came in low and then disappeared. But in the end, the deal closed. I'm not going to tell you the exact figure. It's more than I expected and less than the top-end assessment, which is about how these things go. What I will tell you is that I am not going back to work in HVAC, that I've set up a trust for Warren's kids that they'll be able to use for education, and that I've made a donation to the oncology unit at the hospital where Gloria did her treatments, a donation that will put her name on a room in the infusion center. That last part was the one that made me cry, if I'm being honest. Standing in the hospital administrator's office, signing the paperwork. The woman across the desk was very professional, but she paused and looked at me and said, "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." I said, "She was." Slade found out in June. I don't know exactly how. Probably through Lowell, who probably found out through Douglas's office. Slade called me 4 times in one day. I let it go to voicemail. The messages went from confused to curious to something that wasn't quite angry but was working its way there. I called him back on the 4th day. He asked me why I hadn't sold to them when I had the chance. I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about the morning with the cardboard box. I thought about the Motel 6. I thought about the coffee can and Gloria's letter, and the words, "Don't let anyone rush you. Your mother trusted me with something," I said. I took that seriously. He didn't have anything to say to that. I told him I hoped he was doing well. I meant it. We hung up, and I went out to the backyard and checked on my tomatoes, which were coming in slow but looking promising, and I stood in the warm June evening in my rental yard in East Medford, and I thought about a woman who laughed at something I said at a church potluck 13 years ago, and how sometimes the right person leaves you better than they found you, even in the leaving. I thought about that for a long time. And then I went inside and made dinner, and the house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it's yours. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of enough.